Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ella Sullivan Ramsay, and I'm the Catholic Studies Program Coordinator at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. This webinar from the Ethics and Public Policy Center will equip parents with the knowledge and insights they need to recognize and resist the promotion of transgender ideology in public schools and the tools to protect their children. Today, I am joined by EPPC Fellows Patrick Brown and Mary Rice Hasson and author Maria Keffler. They are with us to share their expertise, sound advice, and the latest research. Thank you all for joining us today, and I would like to allow you all a moment to introduce yourselves.
Thank you. I'm Maria Keffler. I'm a co-founder of the Arlington Parent Coalition in Arlington, Virginia, and co-founder of Partners for Ethical Care.
Patrick.
Thanks. I'm Patrick Brown. I'm a fellow in family policy here at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where I study a variety of topics related to making life easier for families. Prior to coming to EPPC, I was a senior policy advisor with the Joint Economic Committee, where I was researching different topics related to youth investment, from childcare to higher ed to youth mentorship programs, and wrote a policy paper on what I'm hoping we'll have some time to talk about today, the concept of educational pluralism and expanding choices for parents in education.
And I'm Mary Hasson. I'm the Cato Byrne Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And I also direct a program called the Person and Identity Project, which is designed to equip parents, faith-based institutions to promote a holistic vision of the human person and to counter gender ideology. So it's a particular concern. I'm an attorney by background and work on policy matters and legislation related to gender identity and the transgender issue.
Great. Thank you all so much. Maria, could you tell us a little bit more about Partners for Ethical Care and what you do?
Sure. I got involved at the Arlington Parent Coalition when I found out that our school district was putting transgender student policies into place without involving most of the players involved. They were doing it with one special interest group. And Arlington Parent Coalition is now a watchdog group that continues working in Arlington. About a year ago, I started with Partners for Ethical Care. We're an international organization. We're a nonprofit that works to fight the medicalization of children in the name of transgender medicine.
Great, thank you. And you touched on this a bit, but Maria, could you speak a bit to what the current state of our public school system looks like in regards to transgender ideology in education?
Sure. I'll jump in with some of the high level points, and then I think Maria's got a lot to say about what's going on the ground. I think one of the things that parents should know is that under this administration, under the Biden administration, we are having pressure coming top down from the Department of Education to the state level departments of education, to teacher organizations, to advocacy groups, really reinforcing the idea that sex should be interpreted to include gender identity. And there's a host of things that go along with that, including pressure and requirements and policies that will force schools to allow people to access facilities that are typically single sex, whether it's restrooms or locker rooms, on the basis of gender identity, which means the student's self-perception, their asserted belief in who they are. And many of these policies say, for example, that the student's claim to a certain identity needs to be respected. It doesn't have to be validated. It doesn't have to be proved. So really that opens the door to, in every public school, for students of the opposite sex to be claiming an identity that would entitle them to walk into, for example, the girls' restroom or the girls' locker room, or to participate in girls' sports and things like that. So that's coming top down from the current Department of Education. It's coming from state bodies, education bodies. It's also coming from many of the major players in the education space, from the teachers' unions to the associations, for example, secondary school principals, school counselors associations, things like that. So they are all leaning in together to promote this transgender ideology. And so what the net result of that is, it creates a lot of pressure on school boards, because there are many good teachers, principals, school board members who don't buy into this. In fact, I saw a statistic last year that only about half of teachers are on board with this idea of gender identity as being the basis of a student's identity instead of recognizing their biological sex, male and female, which is unchangeable. So even though there are good teachers, this pressure is coming from the top. So what parents need to realize is it's important to be aware of what's going on, even if it's not obvious through the school handbook or the website. You've got to ask questions. You've got to be the squeaky wheel on behalf of your child. One of the pernicious things, one of the most harmful things that's happening in public schools across the country is the policy determination that schools will not tell parents if their own child is expressing a transgender identity and is asking to transition. The school, in many cases, in some of these policies, and I was just looking at a bunch of them last night, in many cases, the school policies themselves say that the school is entitled to initiate a conversation with a child. In other words, a child may not have expressed any confusion at all, and someone from the school is going to reach out and raise this issue about their identity. Are they comfortable being a boy or a girl? And can the school help? So we have the problem of the schools promoting transgender ideology, teaching the kids vocabulary. It's permeating the school culture even more than school curricula. And then you have the added problem of the schools hiding these facts from parents. And I think that is the huge concern for parents, because if you don't know, how can you support your child?
Yeah, Mary, I agree with everything you said. And it's hard to believe that we're at this place in our culture, that this is happening in our schools. I've always been a proponent of public schools. I trained as a public school teacher. I was a high school teacher, and I pulled my children to homeschool 3 years ago because what I saw happening in the public schools was so shocking and so it just felt like a betrayal. It really feels like a betrayal of parents. And what you're seeing is what's happening. Schools are hiding things from parents. When I first got involved with this here in Arlington, somebody in Arlington called this rogue sex ed, that there were these rogue teachers kind of doing this on the side stuff. But I've come to recognize that's not at all what's happening. The gender industry has done a lot of astroturfing. If you're not familiar with that term, it's where they make it seem like this is coming from grassroots. Oh, this is bubbling up from students' need to express themselves. It's not at all. This has been a manufactured, very strategic ideology that's being placed in schools. If you look at the American School Counselors Association, their statement on transgender students, they're very clear in there. They instruct counselors to use a different name and pronouns with the parents than they do with the students. This is active deception of parents. And my organizations hear from parents all the time. My child just announced this transgender identity. This came out of the blue. We have no idea where this came from. Well, it's coming from school. It's coming from social media. It's coming from the culture. This has been a very strategic, planned initiative to capture our kids and kidnap our kids. And parents really need to understand that that's what's happening today.
Great. Thank you both so much. So now that we've covered what the issue looks like, can either of you offer advice, concrete advice for parents, how to find out what's being taught at their children's school, how to address the issue, or any advice you have to offer?
Sure, I'll jump in with a couple of things. One, parents have to know. So you need to ask questions, but you need to probe as well and keep your eye on your own child, because I think one of the things that I would emphasize to parents is, while we want to fight this on the school board level, we want to really work within the school so that the school administration knows there are parents who care and who are not on board with this, who are not okay with science being corrupted and children not being taught the truth about their biology. It is important to just keep your focus as a parent on your own child and to remember there are no do-overs on childhood. So if your child needs to be removed from a situation, do that with confidence. And second, I think just in general, even if your child remains in the school situation, they are being flooded with this pro-transgender narrative, this idea that they can self-define and that they can modify their body and there's really no harm. And so we need to bring the truth to light to our own children and to other parents. The truth is, sex is male or female. It cannot change. And these efforts to modify the body by embarking on transitions cause grave harm, often permanent damage within a short span of time. So that is a key message. This is harmful. It's not benign. And it's not something you can just sort of wait for a child to grow out of. It really takes proactive parenting.
Yeah. Address these things with your kids early on. From kindergarten, from pre-K, they are being introduced to these subjects. You need to be very proactive. If you can get your child out of the public school, I really strongly recommend it. I no longer think public school is a safe place for children. Unfortunately, I know there are a lot of parents who are in situations where that isn't possible. There are parents who they're divorced and they have, both have to agree on education, on medical decisions. And I know of situations where one parent desperately wants to get a child out and the other parent won't allow it. If you're in that situation where you can't get your child out, you need to be very proactive. I talked to a friend of mine who grew up in communist Croatia. She's a Christian. And she said, we knew when we went to school that we were going to receive messages that were anti-Christian. And I asked her, how did your parents prepare you for that? And she said, they just told us. They told us from day one, when you go to school, you're going to hear lies about your faith. You're going to hear lies about your personhood. We need to be telling our kids that. You know what? As Mary said, sex can't change. You're a girl. You were born a girl. You're always going to be a girl. If anyone tells you differently, they are mistaken or they are lying. And you need to be very upfront with your kids and tell them those things before they go to school.
Yeah, and I would add one other thought, and that's reinforcing to our kids when an adult tries to convince you to keep secrets from your parents, or when an adult is willing to keep secrets about something important that's going on in your life, that person does not have your best interests at heart. So we need to be helping our children understand that the school has no place coming in between parents and children. And we need to also put the schools on notice that that's not acceptable, and we're watching and we're going to hold them accountable.
Great. And then, Mary, I was wondering, you mentioned the irreparable harm that can be caused. For parents watching this right now who might not understand what you mean by that, could you elaborate?
Yeah, so one of the things one of the false narratives that's out there is that children know who they are and therefore they can sort of self-define. In other words, they can declare that they simply are someone different than their true identity as male or female. And yet sex cannot change. So what happens under these school policies, and again, this is top down, this is across the country from the smallest school districts to the major school districts. The school districts have taken what is called a gender affirming approach, which means when a child declares either a transgender identity or non-binary, or even says they're questioning it, then the school will simply affirm that identity, no questions asked. Nobody says, why are you feeling this way? Why does it seem so awful to be the female that you are? What's going on here? Nobody's asking those questions. Instead, the official policy is to affirm these children in embracing this alternative identity and then to facilitate a transition. And it's called a social transition, meaning they change their name or their pronouns. They may dress differently. They may start using different facilities within the school, but it's really a psychosocial transition because you cannot start treating a child as other than the person they truly are and expect that not to have consequences. And we know that once these children start walking down that path and are receiving affirmation in this false identity from the adults in their lives, they start to embrace that cognitive distortion. It starts to do a number on who they are in psychological terms. And then from there, from psychosocial transition, we have kids seeking out puberty blockers to put their development on hold, which has a host of physical consequences as well as emotional, but it almost inevitably leads to children pursuing further medical transition, which is cross-sex hormones, which means a child can lose their fertility, their future adult sexual functioning is going to be impaired. They are going to be a medical patient for life. There are problems with the body just in terms of health. Their depression is not going to be alleviated. So there are serious ramifications. And I think one of the most troubling developments I've seen is this connection between public school systems and gender clinics, where you have a pipeline. The schools are teaching it, they're encouraging it, they're facilitating it, and then they're referring kids to these gender clinics that are making tons of money exploiting children and harming children.
I'd add too, I've seen 3 market studies in the last year. These are from market research groups that look at trends in the marketplace and then present to companies how they can maximize those trends. I've seen 3 of them on sex reassignment surgery. That's not even pharmaceuticals. That's simply genital surgery. And they expect it to be an almost $1 billion business in the next 5 years. And I also want to add, I spoke with a young detransitioner recently. It was a young girl who, for a while, said that she was a boy, tried to transition at school. She said that from 6th grade, it was pressure, pressure, pressure at school. She made a statement about her beliefs about sex and gender. She came from a Christian background, made a statement about it. And from the time that she did, she said that's all anyone at school, the kids, wanted to talk to her about. She said every day they were trying to pressure her. Every time she relented a little bit and made a step toward accepting some of the sex and gender propaganda, she was praised, she was encouraged, and by the end of 7th grade, she announced that she was transgender. She told me, I remember making a decision, I am going to be a boy. And when she announced that, she said everyone in the school was her friend. She said she had very shallow friendships, but from that point on, everybody applauded her and was her friend. So she went from being an awkward child who didn't have very many friends to being one of the most popular kids in school. And she talks about it having been a strategic brainwashing of applause and congratulations, moving her toward that.
Great, thank you. So, based on everything you all have said, I'm sure a lot of parents are thinking, okay, so I know the problem, but what's the solution? What do you do if you're a parent? What can you do? I know you both have proposed pulling your children out of public school, but what are the alternatives? Patrick, considering your expertise, maybe you can speak to legal alternatives or policy.
Sure. Yeah, no, as Mary mentioned earlier, I think it's really important that parents be the squeaky wheel when they feel like something isn't right. But I think even if parents across the country were being squeaky wheels, it still wouldn't negate the need for systemic change. I think it's important to recognize that for a lot of people, this use of the school system to advance a particular conception of gender ideology isn't a feature, or it is a feature. It's not a bug. And this is something that, since the beginning of the sort of distinctively American way of providing public education, sort of removing the background of kids and forming them to be citizens in a particular way is something that, like, you would read in the writings of people like Horace Mann and these folks from the 1800s worried about the impact that immigrants from Ireland and Italy and other countries would have on our republic, and we can debate whether or not they were successful in that or not. But this is something that elite organizations and graduate schools of education and the professional groups that Maria mentioned earlier see this as something that they have a chance to really put their stamp on the culture. So I think it's important to recognize why the way that we have the system set up in America right now is not preordained or by any means something that we can't change. And in fact, if you look at other countries across the world, they adopt a much more pluralistic system of providing education, where the government is the funder of a variety of approaches to education rather than the default provider. Whereas in the US, about 90% of students attend a traditional district school model. And for the last couple of decades, I think those of us who come at these things from the sort of center right have found some common ground with people on the left around the idea of school choice when we were talking about charter schools or increasing educational opportunity for poor kids trapped in failing schools and wanting to improve their test scores. And that was all good. And we saw some some movement in that direction, and we saw an increase in districts adopting open enrollment, and I said charter schools and that sort of thing. But I think certainly as the goodwill toward the educational choice movement on the left has declined, and also with the increasing recognition that these issues that we're talking about today have no neutral. It's impossible for a government run school to not take a stance on whether this is something that to be affirmed or to be questioned. And so parents who are choosing the right area or the right environment for their child to be educated in are choosing on a multiplicity of factors beyond just test scores or outcomes. So they want to choose a place where their child feels safe and affirmed, as the story we heard earlier, where they're not necessarily being pressured into one way of thinking or the other with the implicit support of the school administration. And so I think, recognizing that we need to be thinking beyond school choice as just this life raft that we throw to low-income kids, but as something that we should be really broadening to every family, giving all parents the choice to choose the school that's right for them on however they make that decision. And so hand in hand with that, I would say we need to make sure that that if we do want the state to be sort of supporting a variety of approaches, whether that's a faith-based school or a Afrocentric curricula school or a Montessori school, we also need to be making sure that we have some guardrails to make sure that doesn't go completely off the rails, but making sure that the kids are still getting a baseline education, but recognizing that that's a much more honest way of addressing these differences in values that parents disagree on and in good faith disagree on, and that the state shouldn't be imposing one vision of the common good over all the others. And so I think there is reason to hope that this sort of approach does have a legal future right now. Last year or I guess 2 years ago now, in the Supreme Court held that that a state doesn't have to provide funding to private institutions, but if it does, then it can't decide to discriminate against private schools. And there's another big case coming up before the court out of Maine, which will take up that question even further and see where if states that prohibit state funding from going to religious schools can continue to do so. The legacy of these sort of 1800s. We call them the Blaine Amendments that were explicitly intended to try to keep state money from going toward religious schools. So I do think that there is policy avenues that parents can be adopting and pushing forward, and realizing that there's others out there that if you are the squeaky wheel, that there should be opportunities for you to be squeaky with other people and push the conception of government provision of education beyond just the traditional model to one that funds a variety of approaches.
So I'd like to jump in there too. And I think it's important to stress that when we're talking about taxpayer dollars, that we too often think about the government being in charge and doing everything. And we can see across the culture that doesn't work out well, whether it's medical care, whether it's mail delivery and package delivery and things like that. We need to have alternatives. And for many people, charter schools initially looked like it was a promising solution. But the truth is, charter schools are public schools. And so they are subject to the very same constraints that, for example, are now being pushed through the Biden administration and the policies that they're pushing on gender identity. So we really have to decouple the funds from being funneled through the public school system. And we have to allow the money to follow the child. In other words, let parents make the decision, have the education dollars allotted for each particular child's education, but then parents be the deciders about what that education looks like. And as long as the students are achieving certain benchmarks in terms of literacy and perhaps civic responsibility, that should be enough. Because when we look at the record of the public schools, they're not even achieving proficiency across the board. When the NAEP is called the nation's report card. And when you look at the averages in that, it tests fourth graders and eighth graders across the country. And we see in many cases, only a quarter, at most a third of children being educated in public schools achieve proficiency. And in many cities, you don't even have 1% or 2% or 3% of the kids who achieve basic proficiency in reading and math, which means the public schools are completely failing at their most basic task. And yet where they're succeeding is in this social engineering and trying to shape children's attitudes and have children embrace a certain vision of the person, which is really, it's contradictory to the Christian vision. It's contradictory to Judeo-Christian principles. Anyone who's a believer in the Bible, Islam has a problem with the same thing, this vision of the person being sort of self-defined, and you get to pursue sexual license and in your own way, and all the moral boundaries are off. And yet that is what is being proposed through our public schools. That's the official religion. That's the official vision of the person. So we need to call that out and break the money free and let private enterprise really flourish in these towns that have been so dominated, for example, by the economy that revolves around the public school system. We can do better for our kids, and we need to.
Well, and I agree with what you said. Gender ideology is a religion. This is very much a religion. It doesn't just fly in the face of other religions. It flies in the face of reality. It absolutely makes no sense on any number of the metrics that you want to look at it in terms of. But a few years ago, I was on the counseling committee at my children's elementary school. This was probably now 10 years ago. And the teachers, their days were so full that they had trouble putting anything else into their day. The school counselor wanted to do some safety training. So teaching young children, if a man comes up to you at the park and says, "I lost my puppy, help me find him," preparing those kids. And she had prepared some scripts, and she wanted the teachers to kind of work with those scripts. The teachers said the only time they had in their day was standing in line at lunch. Maybe when we're standing in line at lunch, standing in line for music, we'll have those in our pockets and we'll do them in the hallway. And I thought, these teachers are so strapped for time. And yet today, the counselor is coming into English class. I know of this happening in my school district here. Came into a junior high English class and gave a gender presentation to seventh graders and didn't let a seventh grader leave when he tried to excuse himself. So when I see the juxtaposition of those things, why are we putting all of this gender stuff into the day when teachers don't even have time to adequately prepare students, as Mary said, for passing the basic benchmarks of English and math and science? It's because it's a religion and it's now being inculcated in our kids.
So, can one of you speak in layman's terms what school choice is and what educational pluralism might mean? Patrick, perhaps you can do that.
Sure. So I think the basic conception of school choice is exactly what Mary said earlier, giving parents the ability to choose which school is best for them. And that takes a variety of forms across different states that can look like vouchers or education savings accounts. Different states have different ways that they're sort of taking steps toward doing that. The debate, I think we all generally agree that is something that we want to be doing. I think what I would sort of push us to see school choice as itself as a floor, not a ceiling, is that when you put hands right now, if you gave every parent a choice to choose the school that's best for them, still a lot of people would sort of just default to the public school, precisely for the reasons that Maria gave in her sort of previous life, where you can just kind of assume that the public school is watching out for your kid and can provide a decent education, and that's where everyone around you is going. And the default is still a traditional district-run school. And I think if you look across the world, in the Netherlands and other countries in Europe, they don't have a default that everyone sort of assumes is the right one for them. They realize there's a Catholic school in this neighborhood, there's a Jewish school, there's a Muslim school, there's one that specifically focuses on second generation immigrants, there's one that's a STEM school, there's one that's arts focused, and you have you just say the government's job is, as we talked about earlier, making sure there's a baseline performance that everybody is able to perform at grade level and that sort of thing, and then say for curricula and for pedagogical approach and whatever else your school wants to take to that in a pluralistic system, go for it. And so in that sense, it's a much more robust vision than what the charter school movement was trying to do in the 90s. And again, I don't mean to dismiss the efforts that were made in the past. I think there was actual goodwill on the other side of the aisle to explore alternatives to the dominant school system. And we did see, people have more choice in the last couple of decades, and that's wonderful. But now I think we have lost that ability to compromise, and there's not a lot of goodwill from I would say our more progressive friends who again see the idea of imposing a tremendous cultural change through the school system as something to be desired. And so now I think we may as well say, look, we need to be thinking bigger about what education could look like. And rather than just giving parents the option to opt out, let's actually affirm that there should be a variety of options covering all sorts of dimensions of what education can look like. And so that's why I would kind of encourage us to think about.
Yeah, I think one thing I would throw in there too is just parents need to remember they are the continuous force in their child's life. They're the ones who are going to care when a child's in kindergarten, in third grade, in fifth grade, in ninth grade, in 12th grade, how their child is doing both emotionally and in terms of maturity and their spiritual sense, but also their academic ability to learn, taking account of all the different issues they might have, whether it's learning disabilities or whatever. Parents are the ones who see the long game, not the teacher who has them for that particular year, not the school librarian who thinks it's her or his mission to introduce a child to materials that will help them be not transphobic or not homophobic like their parents. And I've literally seen public school librarians saying such things. In other words, there is an activist contingent within our public schools that thinks it's their job to change the beliefs of our children. And yet they're involved in our children's lives for a year or two, and then the child progresses on. And they're not the ones picking up the pieces. They're not the ones who have to help the child integrate all of this into a sense of who they are and what's true. Only parents have that vantage point. So that's another reason why parents need to be the ones who have the power to make that decision about what is going to be best for their children.
And parents need to realize that that is what's happening in the schools. The very first working group meeting that I attended on this issue was a transgender student policy working group meeting at the district level. And there were about a dozen people around the table talking about what they wanted to see in these policies. The takeaway for me and my friend who accompanied me to that, our takeaway was that the school considers parents a threat. Parents are dangerous to their children. And this is what's being taught. This is what Mary's talking about with those teachers. They really think they're being noble and valiant. And what you will hear is you may be the only safe space that child has. So these activist teachers, we've seen it with neighbors, with everyone in the culture is being told that if a parent doesn't agree with the transgender ideology, they are actually being abusive to their children, and they need to be circumvented and they need to be undermined. This is the message that's coming out. I feel like I keep taking this back to the doom and gloom and the horror, but I really want to get that across to parents. There's no middle ground with this anymore. The ideology does not allow for middle ground. You are either on board with it or you will be undermined. And parents need to stand up and need to start taking their authority back and saying, no, these are my children. As Mary said, you have a longer history, a deeper present, and a longer future with your child than anybody in the public school system has.
And I would I agree completely with everything you said, Maria. And I'll offer one anecdote. A couple of years ago, I called a particular public school district in the area that has a policy where they will not inform parents if a child expresses a desire to transition. A child of any age, mind you, any age. It could be a 7-year-old. It could be a 10-year-old. It could be a 15-year-old. If the child says they don't want mom and dad to know, then the school district goes along with that. And so I was talking with this particular administrator who was in charge of facilitating the gender support plans for children who had expressed this desire to transition. And I said, what about the parents? Do you get reactions from parents who are troubled by the fact that they find out 3 months down the road that their child is already being transitioned and you have not told them? And she said that they, the school, view themselves as looking out for the child's safety, and that they're the people they're responsive to are the children. And she related an experience of a parent who was tremendously upset because her child was transitioned without their knowledge, and now they were having these huge emotional and psychological struggles. And the parent walked in and said to this administrator, how dare you? How dare you do this to my child and not even let me know what's going on? And the administrator, frankly, just was cold-hearted and just referred the woman to the legal counsel. But her comment to me was, we're here for the child. So the administrators, many of them may have goodwill, but those who are promoting gender ideology, those who are facilitating transitions, those who are creating a wedge between parent and child, really truly see themselves as the ones who should be influencing and shaping these children, but they have one vision for what is good for that child. And unfortunately, it conflicts with reality. It conflicts with the truth of religious beliefs of people all across the belief spectrum. And it leads children towards harm. And again, these administrators are not going to be the ones picking up the pieces. So parents need to take very seriously the fact that they have to be looking out for their children. And unfortunately, they can't trust what they're being told. They need to look and pay attention to their gut and their instincts about how their child is doing. And if they see this happening, they've got to be prepared to take steps.
I would
Great.
also, is it okay if I
Go ahead.
put something else in there? We've talked about parents addressing this with their kids, keeping an eye on what's going on. And I just want to throw a really simple little toolkit out there for parents. Ask your kids open-ended questions. And open-ended questions are ones that are not easily answered by yes or no. If you ask your child, have you learned any transgender theory in school? They're probably just going to say no and shut down. But if you say, so tell me what you learned in English class today. Tell me the most surprising thing that happened in school today. Has anybody at school said anything that made you think, oh, that's different than what I learned at home? Ask some of those open-ended, real broad questions. It may not go where you think it's going to go. It's very hard to sort of plan conversations with your kids. But when you open up with those sort of high-level, open-ended questions, if anything is on your child's mind, he or she will bring it up with you. And you can have a really powerful conversation where you learn a lot of things you weren't expecting.
Yeah, and I would add one more thing that, sometimes kids are willing to express what they're thinking or what they've been exposed to when you put it not so much in terms of them and what they're thinking, but rather what's happening with their friends. So, one technique that can be helpful is if you can share, for example, I was talking with a mom who was telling me that her child was taught that a boy can become a girl. Have you heard anything like that? What do your friends think? Are they hearing that? And so it's easier sometimes for a child to talk about what their friends are doing or what they've seen without feeling like they're personally on the spot. But the point is, and to Maria's point, ask these open-ended questions to try to discover what your child is absorbing, perhaps not even realizing. They don't have a concept of, quote, gender ideology. They're being taught that this is true. This is the truth about who they are, and they get to decide. And so we've got to just foster those close and loving relationships with our own children and be willing to have those conversations. If our kids hear silence from us or from the churches and things, they're only getting one message, and it's not going to be the truth.
Great. So you actually both naturally took it the direction where I was going to go next, which is we have a long-term solution to keep our eyes on with school choice and policy that increases opportunities for parents to choose the educational opportunity that they want for their kids. I was going to ask you to give some short-term concrete advice to parents, which you just did, but if anyone has anything to add that parents can do right now to help their families and their kids.
I will say, send in what we call a universal opt-out letter. Both Arlington Parent Coalition and Partners for Ethical Care on our websites, we have what we call a universal opt-out letter. The opt-out letter for family life education or sex ed that most school districts provide you if you want to opt out of that, it's only for that very limited class. Maybe it's that fourth or fifth grade class where they separate the boys and the girls and talk about the birds and the bees. If you send in that school opt-out, that's all you're opting out of. But gender ideology is being put into every class. It's being put into English, into science, into math. And so we created a universal opt-out letter that says, I want my child introduced to no gender, sexuality. We've got 4 or 5 things listed there. You can add anything you want and send that to the school. I don't want to suggest that that is legally binding because I don't know. And I do know anecdotally that a couple of schools where parents have sent a bunch of those in, the school, the staff has freaked out a little bit and said, wait, we've got to talk to the lawyers. We don't know what to do with this. But as more and more parents send those in, and if you can get your teachers and principals and everyone to sign it, good luck with that. But if you can get them to sign it, then you've got some proof that they knew what you wanted and what you didn't want. So I really encourage that. And I also encourage, if you're able, get in the school as often as you can. If your school, if you can stuff envelopes or staple papers, anything, get your body into the school as often as you can. Volunteer as a room parent. There's nothing like being there to see what's really going on.
Yeah, I'll add one caveat. I think that's a great idea, Maria, because I think it puts the schools on notice and it lets them know that you care about this and you're watching, and that you have a particular concern in this issue. But there are some legal cases, depending on the part of the country, that say specifically that once parents make a decision about sending their child to public school, they have very limited ability to control what it is they're being taught. And so courts are not necessarily sympathetic to that. And I don't think we should presume that administrators will be either, but that's not to say there isn't value. I think there is value in putting this out there and then coming back and asking and challenging when you see things that are problematic or don't align with that, and then making that public. I mean, one of the best things that we've seen over the past few years has been the willingness of parents to come forward and to say what their children are experiencing in the classroom, and particularly around these issues, as well as critical race theory, because the schools are concerned about image, and politicians have to take a side here. So I think that's to our benefit, and the pandemic was helpful in that score, because I think parents many times got a chance to see and to listen in as to what their children were being told and how things were being broached. Although I'll tell you, at the same time, I've seen policy documents and internal documents from different school districts where they speak specifically about how they are going to get across these concepts in a way that's, quote, private and is not going to be accessible to parents, or that will allow the child to communicate directly with them in a silent way so that they can ask questions. In other words, there are people within the school district who are making it their goal to cut parents out of the conversation. And that's just something we cannot lose sight of. And we need to be proactive and protective along the way.
I would also add just briefly on the sort of, assuming that you are a parent with a kid in the public school system, a lot of times the school board elections and such are specifically engineered to not be during the other times of the year. Like, here in South Carolina, we have an open seat on our school board that they're having a special election exactly 1 week before election day, precisely because they want to have a low turnout election that can be sort of more open to the candidates that have, or the people with a vested interest in the schools, the teachers, and those sort of things. So keeping an eye on that, and also reaching out to the candidates who are running for school board and letting them know that this is an issue that you care about, that they know that if something comes up in front of them, that there's parents out there who are keeping an eye on the decisions that they make, and that it's not just something that everybody agrees with because that's what they hear in the schools, that everybody agrees with this, that no, there's actually a constituency of parents that have grave concerns about the way that these things are handled. And so hopefully if stuff does comes up down the road, you've already sort of put a bug in their ear before it comes up rather than afterwards.
And what advice would any of you give to those parents who maybe want to speak up but are afraid of possible ramifications to them in their community or in their workplace and that sort of thing?
So
That's a real issue. Um, it's hard to speak up. It's hard to swim against the stream. Band together, find other like-minded parents and work together. Don't try to do it alone. That it's really hard to stand up alone. But if you have a group who can attend school board meetings, if you have a group who can maybe create a watchdog group, there's strength in numbers.
yeah. And to that vein, there was a recent video, and we'll put a link up, that was done by parents and faith leaders and just concerned individuals in California, particularly concerned about what was going on in the California schools. As you can imagine, they're always leading fast in the wrong direction, but they have made just a compelling video on the importance of school choice and trying to get that on the ballot. And it's just amazing to see the breadth of different constituencies within society, different faiths, people from all different backgrounds who really are getting behind this issue and saying, we can do better for our children. And so I think a couple of things I would recommend for people is, one, educate yourself. You can go to our website, Person Identity Project, personidentity.com. You can go to Maria's Partners for Ethical Care. They have a great podcast series as well. And Maria's own book, Desist, Detrans, Detox, which is, I think, far and away the best book to empower parents to understand what's going on with the whole gender ideology pressure and to how to deal with the situation if your child is caught up with it. And then also to be aware of the different campaigns that are being conducted. There's one that's called Help Not Harm. There's another one, Promise for America's Children. There are a lot of political efforts that are designed to bring people together around this, because if there's one thing we can be sure of, it's that parents love their kids and we want what's best for our kids. And there are no do-overs on childhood. We need to take this seriously and act now.
Great. Thank you all. I'd like to end this on a more hopeful note. So can you each speak to hopes that you have for the future and positive things that you see happening?
Well, I can say I'm seeing more and more parents saying that their kids are desisting. Parents whose kids have gotten sucked in by gender ideology. I've been surprised over the last couple of months how many parents I'm hearing from who are saying, my child desisted, my child gave this up. More and more parents are seeing what's happening in the schools and taking it on. I'm really hopeful about that because it has seemed very dark. And for the first couple of years, it just seemed like we were going far, far, far down the wrong path and not seeing a lot of those hopeful things happening. But I feel like things are starting to turn. I feel like more and more people are waking up to this. I also want to encourage people. There are a lot of people, as we would say on the other side of the aisle, maybe people who are more progressive, more liberal, more blue and left, who recognize how very bad this is. And I think this is really being pushed by what I've heard called the illiberal left. There are very sane, wise people who see what's going on. My organization, Partners for Ethical Care, we're about half who I would say are conservative right and about half who are progressive left. And we all band together recognizing that this is an insidious, nefarious agenda that is attacking all our children. And it's hopeful to me that we are able to work together on that issue and work together recognizing what a damaging thing this is.
I want to pick up on something that Mary said earlier, where the pandemic, which obviously caused tremendous pain and devastation across the country, but one, I think, silver lining from that has been the disgust that a lot of parents have felt toward how limited the school system was to respond to their needs, both in terms of closing and reopening, mask mandates, the race discussion. This obviously a big part of it. And so, in that sense, I think we've seen a lot of legislative movement picking up on that dissatisfaction that parents have had toward the traditional school system. And there's been some states that have programs that have expanded. There's some that have introduced new ones. The two that I think I'm most excited about is one in Missouri and another in New Hampshire, which basically says if you're a student leaving the public school system to go to a private school or to homeschool or have other educational expenses, we'll cover a large chunk of your expenses related to that. So in Arkansas, it's $4,600. In Missouri, you can get some portion of funding to pay for tuition for another educational choice. And so I think moving toward that and really letting lawmakers know that there's a coalition of parents who's not satisfied with the status quo and that does have a hunger to see more parents have more choice and be able to choose the school that best is the best place for their child in all dimensions. I think that is something that I think we're going to continue to see coming out of this pandemic, and that I do think is reason to have hope.
Yeah, and I would build on that. I think, when we talk about school choice, it's sort of a misnomer. What we're talking about is educational choice. And I think we're seeing an explosion of creativity that was partly fueled by the pandemic, partly fueled by parents becoming aware of what was actually going on in their kids' classrooms and saying, this is not right, or we can do better. And so that creativity, I think, is a cause for hope. There are hybrid options. There's homeschooling has exploded. There are smaller schools. There are all sorts of options that are developing. And so that creativity, that American innovation, I see as a cause for hope. And then the final point, I think, is this, that the truth has its own power. And so when people are bold enough to stand and to speak the truth, we energize others, we give others courage, and we bring the truth to a much larger audience. So be bold, speak the truth, have hope, and do what's right for your child.
Great. Thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. You can access links to both Mary and Maria's books on the webpage for this event, as well as links to helpful resources. Thank you all for joining us and have a great day.